Okay, welcome everyone to this reactivated session. And the reactivated sessions are that we've run this session before, and we'll point you to where you can get to the resource and the recording from that session. And what we're doing is continuing the topic, but the idea is that it's more flipped, more focused on activities, and more rooted in real experience of practitioners. So we have additional and new guest speakers, and we this time we've also got a panel of speakers as well. So on to that later. On my shared screen, you'll see that there's also some instructions on how you can get to the journeys, the mini courses that we created, and they're all free to access. And there's a link to a step-by-step guide as to how you can get to those. We'll share the learning object with you at some point during the presentation, or certainly before we finish. We usually ask you during the registration what you most want to learn, and Lillian likes to do a quick analysis and summary of that. So what did you find, Lillian?
Yeah, so obviously on topic, most people were interested in what to think about when they're selecting tools. So lots of people mentioned this idea of a framework. They wanted to be able to kind of be guided through a thinking process. So we're going to cover that today. They wanted to ask about the implications of using free tools, how to future-proof our courses, how to blend online and face-to-face after COVID. So that's something quite different, obviously, from when we ran this webinar 2 years ago. How to enhance my online or blended teaching. Again, that's different from before. Ideas to pass on to colleagues. Very key things around accessibility, privacy, and copyright. How to integrate free non-institutional tools into the digital infrastructure, and Matt will speak to that. How to influence others to choose accessible tools, and I feel very much our guest speaker Suzy Miller will help us to kind of talk through some of that as well. And then just extending knowledge of freely accessible tools. I think we're speaking to a lot of people who are very interested in learning technology anyway. So they're very keen to network here and find out what we have to say.
We've been adding a kind of page that just does a quick summary of the things that are earlier on in this resource. You can see we're already on page 29 of this resource. So everything before this was from the previous session, and you've got the recording. You'll have access to the recording of that as well as the recording today. So there's links here to remind you about the things that we think are worth checking. And if I open just a couple of them, one is that there's this quick knowledge and confidence check that you might want to just try. And if I just I won't do it, but you'll get questions where you can slide and then submit and then answer them again. And then when you move on to the next page, it won't you have to open it a new window, but there'll be if you want to compare, if everybody did this during this session, for instance, or afterwards, you would see your last attempt, an average of your attempts, but also then an average of everybody else's attempts. It's not a good reflection as we see right now, but like I say, when everybody responds, then you'll be able to see that. There's also, and Suzy's going to talk a lot about this, but a resource that we created at the time for one of the webinars to encourage you to use the same assets, the same text and images to compare the outputs from different formats. So you can see the standard document formats here of PDFs and Google Docs and PowerPoints, but also some e-learning tool output. And you can download the text and images and recreate this resource. So we're on page 4 here. If I go back, there's a whole load of guidance about accessibility. So if you reuse it, it will help you kind of focus on some of those things as well. Lillian's going to talk in depth and give an example of the Appraise tool in a moment. So we usually like to encourage people to be, active as a post-session task and not just kind of park it and then think that you'll revisit it sometime. So a couple of suggestions of things that you might want to do immediately. Do you want to talk about the Appraise tool now then, Lillian?
Yeah, if you don't mind clicking on it. So if we if we were a little bit more organized, we might have been able to pick one of you to come live and work through this Appraise tool with us. I am just going to share the link in the chat so you might be able to see the questions a little bit easier. So in the chat, you've got the page number as well. So you can now see the questions a bit earlier. So we were thinking that rather than getting you to fill this in, which would have led to, I don't know, we did this in the first webinar, and there was a lot of silence while people were typing. And we're not very good with silence, are we? We're all, you know, a lot of us here are teachers. So I'm going to think through, I'm going to model this material for you. I think, Ron, are you all right to kind of type a little bit, just a few keywords? Okay, so what tool am I going to appraise? Okay, I'm going to appraise the Thorium ebook reader. This is something that Alistair introduced to me yesterday. And I thought, oh, I'd love all my students and staff to have access to an ebook reader at the uni, because so many students are downloading EPUBs as their alternative format, but we don't have a reader that we recommend. So what benefit are you hoping to get? I would say for my learners that they will have a reader to use with their downloaded EPUB formats. This is where voice dictation works for a tool like that. So the next thing that it asks me to think about straight away is accessibility. So this ebook reader, would it work with a deaf person? I'd say yes. Would it work for someone with poor spelling or reading? I guess I haven't evaluated that bit. I'm not sure that as an ebook reader, it reads out to me, but I think Alistair said it did. So I'm not sure, something I might have to think about and go and check. Would it work for someone with poor or fine motor control? I'm going to say yes, because assuming they have already adapted their web browsing, they'll be able to use the EPUB reader. Would it work with a visually impaired person? Yes, I think it will be screen readable, so the person can actually use the tool. Any other comments or questions on accessibility? Like I say, I'm going to go and find out about its tools for poor reading, poor spelling or reading. Okay, so that would be my own reflection. So on the next page, we have platform compatibility. And so it's now asking me, can I use the tool through a browser on different devices? I would say that's a yes. Do you need to have an app installed? Yes is the answer, because I know that because I've had to go and ask Software Center at the university to make it available so that all students can download it to the machines that they want. So next, pedagogy. In what context can the tool be used? Fieldwork. Yeah, it's a book. How many people bring books with fieldwork? But it's possible. So I would take possible. Collaboration? No, I don't think it's a collaborative tool. I don't think you can make notes and share it with others. Work placements? Definitely. They could use it when they're away. Discussion, debate? I don't think so. That would be a no. My subject, I would say definitely. So you can use ebooks with any subject. Further comments? How does it encourage engagement? It's not really an engagement tool. So I might not, worry about answering that. Are there other ways this resource helps engage learners? Awarding digital badges? Nope. What media types of sources are included? Text, images, I'm tempted to say. I know it's an ebook reader, but I suspect it would still expose images and alt text as well. Video, no. Audio, I suspect it might, you could use your screen tools, I think, to read it out. So does the tool allow the tutor to save a digital record of what individual learners have done? no. And then next. So here we go. Recognizing copyright privacy and e-safety. Is there guidance on finding copyright-free images, video, text whilst using the tool? I'm not sure, but being an ebook reader, I suspect it might point us to sources of free ebooks. I hope so. Privacy and e-safety. Do we need to moderate contributions? It's not a collaborative tool, so I would say no. And then go on to next. Authentication, ease of use. I think this is the key reason why we want it. It's easy to use. So do learners need to sign up in order to use it? Don't know. Don't think so. Again, I would need to check that. So, you know, this is something for me to note down. How intuitive is the no tutor interface, really? It's meant for an individual to download. Learner interface, quite easy. Alistair was showing us yesterday, and I feel confident I'd be able to just pick it up and run with it. Does the tool provide an embed code? Not relevant. Maybe we need it and not applicable here. Which of the following options does the tool provide to share the resource with learners? Not applicable as well, but it's made me think about it. And you can imagine if I was picking a collaborative tool like Padlet or something else, that's very important. So next, sustainability. Now, what if the platform ceases to exist or becomes more commercial? Now, that's always a possibility, right? So we just need to have a plan in place. I don't know how many of us spend enough time thinking about that, to be honest. There are lots of EPUB readers out there, so, you know, we can always switch to something else. How transferable will the resources be? That's fine. All our EPUBs are available on our VLE or through our library, so that's not a problem. So I would then submit. Now, when you submit, you can view, it says view accuracy, but you get some feedback. And you can also see other people's responses. Lots of people have entered things around Mentimeter, Kahoot, Padlet, and lots of other tools like that. You can edit your own response and submit another response. Now, we used Google Forms, so obviously the feedback here isn't always appropriate for the type of question. But so use that with a pinch of salt. But it's quite interesting, I think, to challenge our thinking before we recommend a tool and to have a framework that every colleague could kind of use. So yeah, you can create a copy of the form. As you can see, there's an orange button on the left of the form itself. When you click on it, it'll offer to copy the form to your own Google account. This can be a free Google account. So yeah, hopefully you'll find that helpful for thinking through your use of apps as well. So next we will have Matt, I think, is our next person on our, I think you have to jump forward now, Ron, to Matt's page. So Matt is our first speaker from University of Southampton, and I know him from many, many years, I think, Matt. We've kind of known each other on and off through digital Twitter, and we've been around the e-learning block many times. But more recently, because both our institutions use Blackboard, we meet up at Blackboard events. But over to Matt, who will share with us this idea of how we can be savvy when using non-institutional tools.
Thank you very much, Lillian, and hello, everyone. And so my name is Matt Deeprose from the University of Southampton, and I just need to just get my screen sorted here one moment, and then I'll be there. All right, fantastic. So please do save any questions until the end. And if you'd like to connect with me, I've put my links and links to everything that I refer to in the chat. So you've got those in there also on the Xerti. So the background to this is over the last year, I think we've always had this, but in particular over the last year, had more staff queries about attractive tools that we don't have or don't support. And they might even be tools that replicate functionality that we already have. And so there was a kind of increasing concern about what that meant in terms of student support if they had questions, and also privacy, sustainability, and of course, accessibility. So working with some colleagues, we've been doing a piece of work to, first of all, create some like guidance and overview for staff about what to consider before they use a tool that isn't supported essentially by the university. And then based on what we learned from that, creating some criteria for assessing such tools to then make some recommendations of tools that are out there that we kind of feel should be good and say kind of safe to use in inverted commas. And right now we're about finalizing our criteria, and we've just on Monday kind of soft launched our overview, which you should find the link in the chat there. And through the next slides, I'm just going to give you an overview of this overview, but of course there's much more detail on that web page. And
sorry, Matt, just to interrupt.
Yes.
I don't think the screen's actually sharing. So
I'm terribly sorry.
So I think we might just need to.
Thank you for letting me know. So that's probably my other tip there is sometimes you have some sources or some online platforms, you click on share once and it shares straight away. And in Zoom, you have to click twice, which has caught me out in the past before. So let's get back to where I was. So sorry about that. Hopefully you'll be able to see the rest of the slides from Xerti. Can you see these slides now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. So, right, we're standing on the shoulders of giants, and some giants in particular I'd like to shout out are Reading, who have some great resources about supporting third-party apps and tools, and Massachusetts have a very useful website where they not only talk about tools for teaching in terms of privacy and accessibility, but they also show how those tools align with the SAMR model: substitution, augmentation, modification, and redefinition, and also talks about what types of learning activities those tools are suitable for. In terms of our overview itself, we cover several different aspects. So first of all, looking at whether we already have a tool that might do something similar to what someone would want to use an unsupported tool for, or also considering what if staff or colleagues prefer using a tool rather than what we support. So it's important that staff know how to find what is available, which might be on our IT website or our e-learning guide, and letting them know that they should raise a ticket if they are still unsure whether it's something that we offer. In terms of if they were thinking about using a tool that's similar to what we have, but not what we support, we really would want to know why. Particularly for our kind of planning. Also, there might be a way that we could improve the tool that we do have if we develop it ourselves, or send feature requests to the vendor. Or we looked at that tool and we found accessibility or privacy issues with that tool, and we might be able to share some lessons from that. In terms of data and privacy, I think maybe some colleagues won't know the kind of full spectrum of the work that's involved in rolling out a tool centrally within a university. For an example here, we would do an initial data protection review, which might then require a data privacy impact assessment, which is quite rigorous and then gets logged with our legal team. So I had a review of the Information Commissioner's Office kind of overview about these things, which is particularly useful, and trying to break it down to what I thought would be straightforward for colleagues who are obviously very busy to think about what to understand or what to think about. For if we were to say, avoid using personal and sensitive information, so sensitive being special category data, such as like health, ethnicity, those sorts of things, avoid putting those into that tool, telling others as well that this is something they should avoid doing, and ideally not making it compulsory to have to use that unsupported tool as part of, say, core teaching or something like that, only as an addition. That was checked by our legal team as well, by the way, checked the wording. Sustainability obviously is very important. And another aspect of what goes into providing a supported service is we would do like disaster recovery, set up backups, have support guides, helpline integrated with other university services, single sign-on authentication, and so on. And those you don't necessarily get with an unsupported tool. Perhaps more importantly, the charging model might change. What would you do if that service was quickly withdrawn? I'm sure many of you are aware of different Google services that have been end-of-lifed. Despite many people really enjoying using them, I'm still mourning over Google Reader after all these years. So the overview kind of makes recommendations on about planning for those contingencies if you were to use an unsupported tool. Copyright and liability, the overview would ask you to consider whether you have to waive your moral rights, your rights to be identified as the author of content, or and your right to object to like derogatory use or treatment of that content, and would you retain ownership? There are some interesting aspects about ownership of content created with university tools, which I'm safely stepping away from and saying are out of scope of this presentation. Of course, accessibility might be the most important. So within the overview, we talk about our legal responsibility under the public sector body's accessibilities regulations. And we also have a section there that tries to answer that response you may sometimes hear, but I don't have any disabled students, so I don't need to worry about this. And to try to make it as straightforward as possible, we're saying make sure that the service or app has an accessibility statement that's up to date before using it. In terms of that overview guide, that kind of covers what we put into that guide, but of course the online version has much more detail. So right now we're finalizing that criteria for assessing further tools that we might then recommend. So I can share that draft criteria so far, what we're thinking. We're saying that the app should be free of charge, and any limitations should be about how much you can use the app, not for how long you can use it. So by that I mean, like, for example, a 100 megabyte limit or free user limit, but not you can use this for 30 days and then you're going to have to pay if you want to continue using it. That's definitely not sustainable. And if it were supported by advertising, that's acceptable, but we would want to be noting that. We'd also want to ensure that you're not required to submit personal or sensitive information before you can use it, as well as recommending not to put that in when you are using the app. And likewise, you wouldn't want to be using that for confidential information, research data, that kind of thing. Furthermore, we wouldn't be recommending apps which are alternatives to tools we do have university-wide supported. So we want to maximize the return on investment of our current offering and also provide a more coherent experience to staff and students. And of course, that any app or service we would recommend should have an up-to-date accessibility statement. So far, the overview has been shared and we're awaiting feedback. I've got a few final thoughts, like maybe, is it a bit too restrictive? Will it just be ignored? Time will tell, but that's where we're at. I'm not sure whether we break for questions now or we go straight to the next speaker, but that's what I wanted to share with you for now today. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Matt. We welcome questions in the chat for now. And then when we get to panel and open mic, we can delve into those questions a little bit more. Matt, feel free to answer any questions in the chat as well. Next up, just to keep us on time, we have Suzy Miller, who is for those of you who do know Suzy, she's now an author as well of a book, Designing Accessible Learning Content. And she's got a lot of L&D experience, learning and development experience, and used a lot of authoring tools. So welcome, Suzy, to your session.
Hi, Thanks very much. Just to, before I start, just to check that you can you still share, my screen is shared?
Yes, yes, it is. Thank you very much, Suzy.
Okay, well, thanks for the lovely introduction. So I'm going to be talking to you in my 10 minutes about the evaluation of accessibility of e-learning authoring tools. So the reason I'm focusing on actually e-learning authoring tools is that is my particular area of expertise. But I think the things that I'm suggesting would work equally well. They're equally valid for tools, for example, which create content. So things I was discussing with Alistair, for example, like maybe plugins for virtual learning environments or even content management systems. So the accessibility that we're looking at is just maybe a bit of a deeper dive into what we've been talking about already. So in this presentation, I'm going to start by focusing on the accessibility requirements that we need to be aware of when we're choosing tools, and then give you some examples of best practice that I found, particularly in e-learning authoring tools. And then finally, we'll have a couple of next steps that might be useful for you to take away from the session. So if we just start with, I'll just go to our next slide. So as an e-learning accessibility consultant, one of the most common questions I'm asked about is what tools are best for accessibility? And that's actually quite a difficult question to answer for a few reasons. And first of all, authoring tools are constantly being updated, and luckily more tool providers now are becoming aware of how important accessibility is, and so they're making improvements to their tools on an ongoing basis. So it's really difficult to say, okay, at the moment this is the best tool, etc. Another issue is that accessibility is just one of the requirements that you need to be aware of when you're selecting a tool, and they kind of need to be balanced with other considerations. So you could have a tool, for example, which is really good for accessibility, but maybe doesn't have the advanced functionality that other tools might have. Or you could have a tool which has good accessibility functionality, but doesn't really give you much support with how to use that. Or you could have functionality which is good, but it's difficult to find and implement. So those are the kind of the background that to be aware of when you're first thinking really about looking at the accessibility of some tools. But there's still some important considerations that are useful to be aware of when you're evaluating the accessibility of authoring tools. So we'll start just by making sure we're clear about the definition of accessibility and how that then shapes the requirement of the authoring tool. So I have a definition here. Accessibility means that people with disabilities can equally perceive, understand, navigate, and interact with content. It also means that they can contribute equally without barriers. So that definition is one of my favorite, comes from the W3C. And the reason I think it's so good is it kind of gives you a broad overview of what someone should be able to do with your tool. And the idea also that if you are not making things accessible, either because of your own practice or because of the tool, then it's this idea of creating barriers. So let's break that down a bit further now, and we'll start going back to the Appraise tool. So the questions that you had that Lillian showed you in that Appraise tool, I think are a really good starting point. They're kind of a really good overview of some of the things that you should be thinking of. If I just show you the next slide, this is a slide that I tend to focus on when I'm sort of digging deeper into what you need to be able to provide from an accessibility point of view. So I think, you know, it's always very useful, I think, to have which exactly was covered in the tool, but to kind of think back to vision, hearing, motor, and cognitive, those 4 different categories, and also maybe digging a little bit deeper into some of those requirements. So for example, when you're looking at vision, maybe being aware that actually students with colour blindness is something to be aware of. With your cognitive differences, I think we were talking about maybe someone with dyslexia, but it can be broader than that. And I think also coming back to that motor impairments as well, always thinking from a digital accessibility point of view, that motor impairments is really about dexterity and being able to use the hardware, and ways that someone, for example, could use a keyboard instead of a mouse. That would be an important requirement. So those 4 broad categories, I think, are kind of, as I say, digging a little bit deeper into what we need to consider from an accessibility point of view. And I would say that there are when you're looking at the accessibility of an authoring tool, there are some key requirements. So some sort of really basic things that you would need to make sure that that authoring tool could do. So just to give you an example, I think these are the four that I've picked out. So from a visual point of view, the ability to add alternative text to images. From a hearing point of view, the ability to add captions either as a separate file or with a captioning tool. And of course, they can also be externally added to embedded videos as well. So it just needs to have that functionality. Keyboard compatibility is really key. Also for making sure that that is also relevant for audio and video controls, and then also a visual focus indicator to show any of the interactive elements that are in that tool. Ability to control moving content and giving learners the control over any timing constraints is a key one, I think, for if you're looking at cognitive impairments. So I think that I wanted to start with kind of these are the basic requirements that's a really good starting point when you're evaluating the accessibility of tools. But if we dig a little bit deeper now into the legislation that you need to be aware of. So it's just a good reminder, I think, to go over this idea of the fact that the requirements are actually set out by the Equality Act, which says that every organisation has an anticipatory duty to make reasonable adjustments for people with disabilities, and your authoring tool needs to be able to actually make reasonable adjustments for people. Then we look at the public sector bodies accessibility regulations, which Matt touched upon. And that's also really important from that point of view of having the benchmark. And although the Equality Act is underpinned, I think, by the WCAG guidelines, I think the public sector bodies accessibility regulations makes it very clear what your legal requirements are, and that is that your authoring tool should be compliant with WCAG 2.1 levels A and AA. And something that I always advise people to do is to actually provide an accessibility statement for the learning that you produce using an authoring tool. So if we look at the implications of that, then actually from a WCAG 2.1 point of view, there are actually 50 accessibility guidelines that your authoring tool should be meeting. And to support that, it's just useful to know that there are also some specific authoring tool accessibility guidelines, which some people aren't aware of. So these were published in 2015. They're not a legal requirement like WCAG are, but they are really useful to be able to show you really, I think, the kind of commitment to accessibility that your authoring tool and provider is showing. So the two key things that they should provide, there's obviously lots and lots of different guidelines that are within the tool accessibility guidelines, but the two key things really are making sure that the authoring tool is accessible itself for people with disabilities, a really important criteria, but also that they help authors to create accessible content by ensuring that the output conforms to those WCAG standards, and also by providing support and guidance for people to do that. So if you have, I think coming back as well to Matt's presentation, he was saying a key requirement was making sure you have an up-to-date accessibility statement. So if we dig a little bit deeper into an accessibility statement, this is a really good example from the Xerti online toolkits, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. And it shows, I think, really good practice for what an accessibility statement, the type of information that you should be getting from your authoring tool. And again, that's a really good place to start to see that commitment to accessibility from the authoring tool provider. Another option that you sometimes see, especially if you're looking at authoring tools which are from the States, is what we call the voluntary product accessibility template, or a statement. So that should be template, and that's called a VPAT. So this is an example of a good VPAT from an authoring tool called CourseArc, and it will break down each of those web content accessibility guidelines for you and tell you how the authoring tool meets them. Best practice as well, as we said, is also coming back to that ATAG requirement, is to give you support on how you can actually implement that. So if your tool is very good on accessibility, it should not only tell you how it's meeting the WCAG requirements, but it should also give you some extra information on how you use that tool specifically to implement the WCAG. That's a real key best basically best practice feature. So I'm going to focus now on some more specific tools and just show you some sort of the very best practice that I've found in my own research, and that these are the things that will really tell you on about how good the accessibility of the tool is. So one of the things that I love are tools that very clearly show you when you're setting up your project, for example, any themes or any color schemes, etc., which are accessible. So this is an example from a tool which is called Domino 1, and it shows really clearly that some of the themes there are which ones are WCAG accessible. So I love the fact that it's really clear and easy to see upfront which themes you should be choosing to make it accessible. Another best practice, best practice around accessible interactions that I found is tools that sometimes give you an alternative. So for example, if you have a drag and drop activity which is not accessible for keyboard only users, you will find that some tools will automatically give you an alternative activity, and you can see this here in the course arc option. You can see that you've got drag and drop activity. If you put that into your learning intervention, it will automatically provide the alternative activity for you. Comprehensive guidance, again coming back to Xerte, this is kind of taking it a step further from your WCAG and just diving deeper into the requirements of students. So I love that. If you can get more, as much guidance as you can possibly get. Another good option is guidance in the workflow. So if you don't have to go somewhere else to look for that guidance, but it will tell you. So this example is from Adapt. If you put a video, for example, into Adapt, it will tell you that if you make it automatically play, that is against the WCAG guidance. So that's really great, another great feature. And the last one we have is access to underlying code, which can be really helpful if you're trying to work out how accessible, for example, the coding of your the underlying coding is. So very quickly, just some next steps. Just to refer to the book that Lillian kindly mentioned, this has more information about not only the tools that you can use for designing using e-learning authoring tools, but it also breaks down the WCAG guidelines and gives you examples using a whole range of tools. So hopefully that might be useful. And then finally, this is if anyone is doing this work into looking at accessibility statements for tools, there is a really helpful text box and the search box part of text box, which allows you to document this for other people. So this has been on my to-do list for a long time. You can see that at the moment there are only 2. So if you do happen to be looking at the accessibility statement of an authoring tool, it would be fantastic if you could then add it for everybody else also to benefit into text box. Okay.
Thank you very much, Suzy. That's just all such good sound advice. And I think we now have the opportunity to run our panel. So I think our panelists are going to turn on their cameras so you can see us. And these are some of the key questions that we're going to kind of address as we chat, but by all means do interact with the panel via the chat and ask any questions. So like, for instance, if all our panelists have their mics turned on now, Laura, I think you can join in as well. But I would like to introduce and allow Craig for our panel, apart from our 2 speakers. We have Craig Mill from Call Scotland and Laura Hutton from JISC. So I'll let them introduce themselves.
Hi, my name's Craig, and I'm based at Call Scotland at the Edinburgh of the University of Edinburgh, although I'm working from home just now in Linlithgow, and I'm the Assistive Technology Advisor at Call Scotland.
Okay, thank you.
And hi, I'm Laura Hutton and I work for JISC. You probably know Kelly Moat. She is, I've not taken over from her. I have the joy of now working alongside Kelly with JISC as the subject specialist for accessibility. And I have a FE background in assistive technology. So happy to be here today.
Thank you. So we have very, very very good comprehensive coverage. I think between us all, we should be able to answer some of the questions that our colleagues have. So one of the key things that people asked for was how to influence others to choose accessible tools. Ron, have we gone to R.I.P? Okay. And how
sorry, I was just copying the link.
All right, thank you. How to influence others to choose accessible tools. So would anyone like to hazard a suggestion?
Yeah, I could, just to check, because I was just fascinated watching Ron copy the link over. We're talking about how to influence others to choose accessible tools. Just to check that.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
So something that I know I've been working on with some colleagues is seeing how to build that empathy so that our colleagues understand the kind of lived experience of someone who may have difficulty using a tool to see examples of what that's like. An example might be with links. If you're using a screen reader and you're tabbing through a page and the screen reader is telling you click here, click here, click here as you move through a page, and you are trying to find the important information about where to submit your assessment, you can imagine the kind of stress that might build up in you. And that's just a simple example, but we've been looking at ways to build that empathy. And there's a really good book, a free book that I've been reading from DEC about, or from DQ, about the agile approach to managing accessibility or something, which I'll dig out the link and I'll put in the chat because that has some examples along those lines as well. So my top answer would be about trying to increase empathy in our colleagues so they understand why it's important to choose to use accessible tools.
That's brilliant. And I think it would be really interesting if some of us took that away and did it as a bit of an action research project to see if that works, or if we need to develop, I don't know about you, but as a learning technologist, you have to dabble in a lot of other things like behavioral psychology and mindfulness and motivation and coaching, basically. So very, very good point, Matt. This kind of using empathy. It would be nice to do an action research project to kind of test it out on, like, say, 10 people in your organization and see if that empathy approach works, and then kind of gather our results. That would be really helpful. Anyone else from our panel would like to answer that?
I'll follow on from that, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I agree a lot with what Matt said there. And I often talk about winning over hearts and minds. I think that when you're trying to convince someone or influence them to pick a tool that's more accessible, I really like to try and tell them how that tool will support them, because these accessible tools are not just for those who have a specific need. They can benefit everyone. Everybody has, in that neurodiversity, we all have days and moments when we peak and trough and excel and struggle. So I think that, appealing to the individual's own sense of what they need from an app and how it will help them to produce work or to manage their workload often results in them going, oh, I didn't realize it did that. I so would like that when I work with something. And then it benefits them as well as the practice that they then do with their students or their other staff.
Brilliant.
Okay, at Call we have quite a lot of sort of videos and case studies of users who, for example, maybe who are using a communication device, who had maybe have difficulties communicating, but then we can see the contrast with a good communication device and a communication app that enables them to communicate much more easier than they would have without it. Or learners who maybe can't access a physical book, but with a switch access, we've got the Scottish Book Trust PowerPoint books where they can read stories and participate in classroom activities as well. So just those kind of user case studies are really good ways of bringing people on board.
Brilliant. And I think the next question that I think would be quite useful for us to address is this idea of how to future-proof our courses. Do we think that's possible? I think we all have experience of tools that have come and gone. We have this lovely page called R.I.P. digital tools. So yeah, does anyone in the panel and does anyone in the audience have any examples of how they've tried to future-proof your courses?
I don't have an example of a course that I've tried to future-proof, but I would say that one way we could help future-proof, I'm not, like you said there, Lillian, I'm not sure if it's possible to do that because things are always changing, the tools, the content, you update things all the time. So possibly it's just about making it super clear to everybody involved that if they have a need or a requirement that course isn't giving them, that they flag it straight away and it will be actioned straight away to then proof it better for the next generation of users, or whoever comes to use it will have benefited from that adjustment, possibly.
I'd be interested in hearing from Suzy whether or not not so much the future proofing, but almost the back compatibility. So on some of the tools that you've looked at, Suzy, is there any suggestion that sometimes when there's a new upgrade to a content creation system, that now it does all these amazing things, so it's future proofed in that sense, but in the process it means that none of the old versions work? Has that been something you've come across?
Yeah, I think that's a really key point, actually. But there are so many, there's so much legacy content out there, and I think it comes to that question when you're looking at the priorities. It's you work with an organization, and it's some people will think, well, draw a line under the sand and move forward, and from any content from this point, we'll make sure that we're using the most up-to-date version of the tool, and we are using all of the accessibility features. But there is that real key consideration of what do you do with your legacy content, and I think it then comes back to sort of prioritizing what is, looking at what is essential, what is essential to keep, and what that you decide that you are going to work on to make more accessible. So yeah, it's a really good point, actually.
There's a tension. I have discussions with organizations quite a lot about whether they should offer content direct in their VLE or LMS versus using an external authoring tool. And there's a tension there, isn't there? Because actually there can be some real plus points to authoring natively in the VLE. But then what happens when the organization decides to change the VLE? And in my experience, people will often think, well, we'll worry about that when it happens. But actually it can happen really quickly. And there isn't time to do that transfer. Stories of people moving from, for instance, Moodle to Teams, or from Blackboard to Canvas, or whatever. And so there's a real kind of advantage, but a tension, like I say, between the considerations there.
And also regulations, obviously we're all in the middle of the public sector bodies, accessibility regulations that mean we have to reconsider some of the tools we might have been using for a while. And it's quite interesting that that can now be a lever or a driver for more accessibility, but it also has created that kind of dilemma whether, and I often have this discussion with Alistair, and Alistair is a very good proponent of not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And just because one person finds one tool difficult doesn't mean that you should necessarily abandon it, but maybe diversify a range. Maybe that's one way to future-proof things. If we always planned that, okay, I'm going to have everyone type into the Google Doc, but if someone comes from a country where they can't access a Google Doc, we will also allow them to type in the chat, that kind of thing. And then afterwards you copy and paste. So I guess these plans, Ali made a very good suggestion that we're the ones who have to future-proof us. It's not about the tool. You can't You never know when the tool's going to get the rug pulled, but we know ourselves. We're in control of our own skills and mindset, which loops us back to how do we influence our colleagues to develop digitally savvy skills. So yeah. Just one more. I think I'd like Craig to speak to this, because Call Scotland, I mean, your apps that you kind of where you kind of show, you know, how useful it can be for various assistive needs. You must have quite a thing to renew that every year.
Yeah, well, we do our best to update the apps when we can, but we're only a team of 10. We have so much on that it's difficult to do that, but we do our best to keep them updated, and they are constantly evolving and changing as well. So it's a difficult process, especially with so many of the app wheels, and even with a lot of the posters I've done myself about looking at the built-in features. They change as quite often, and I mean, 10 years ago, I wrote a book on using the iPad to support additional support needs, and when the next iOS came out, it was more or less kind of out of date. I learned that lesson very, very quickly.
Don't say that now, because Suzy's very excited about her book being published.
So I'd like to know, Craig, how did you? So as you've learned that lesson, so what is your new approach then?
Well, that was to doing the sort of posters, the infographics, videos, that just to sort of keep things updated. So it was like they supplemented the kind of book that we wrote, and really built on some of the things that are in there. But it's a lot of work. It really is.
It is a lot of work. So I would kind of think that a little bit of crowdsourcing would be fabulous. At our level, there's a possibility of other learning technologists and teachers interested, but also from us working with students, people have said that review cycle where the students are the ones giving you the feedback, that's a helpful, healthy way to kind of keep things up to date. I mean, for future teacher, the way we're keeping things up to date is by rerunning the webinar, and then we go through the learning object again and we update the links. So you always have, well, within every 2 years, you have an up-to-date learning resource. Dominic's got his hand up, I've noticed. I think.
Yeah, I just pasted a link in the chat, might have been enough instead of that, but I was just thinking, sometimes we worry too much about future-proofing things too early, and then because there's a cost to future-proofing, and sometimes like the Google Reader example is a good one, because I had this tool for 5 years and then it went away, and that's fine, but I had 5 years of glorious enjoyment of Google Reader, and then I found Feedly, and so I kind of think of it as like, actually I'm creating something that I can use, and sometimes I would never create it if I had to think about future-proofing it and getting a foundation going to make sure that it's supported and stuff like that. Sometimes it's sad that things go away, but I would rather have them for a little bit and then sort of maybe them go away. And the link that I pasted is about startup scaling too early. You know, so sometimes you say, well, you could have avoided all these problems if you had scaled too early, but you would have never had those problems because you would have spent all your money and resources on things you didn't need at that time. So that's kind of my feeling, that there are some good sort of basic common sense practices to do it, but perhaps overdoing it may be harmful occasionally.
That's a lovely point to finish on, a different perspective, almost from a kind of point of view of a supplier of a tool. And you make that point very well, Dominic. Thank you very much for that. So I think to keep to our timetable, Ron, I think we're going to move on to next steps.
Well, yeah, but I suggest we all keep our cameras and mics open, and I'll just quickly run through the last couple of pages that we have and put the link in the text chat as well, and then then we can finish off back here with us all kind of talking. So the last few pages very quickly, I mentioned earlier in the session that we have these journeys that we created, and there's a step-by-step guide as to how you can sign up and get access to those. And the journeys are effectively mini courses that followed our webinars but allow you to put into practice and then reflect on some of those topics. There's a page about us and contact details and so on if you are interested in taking some of our resources further. A reminder that our next session is on designing appropriate assessments, and just like some of the guest speakers we've got today, we'd encourage you, if you'd be interested in doing a guest slot on that topic, contact us. There's a contact button there, or at the very least sign up, and the registration form is already on our page where you registered for this webinar. Just navigate to that session. We always ask you to reflect on the session before we finish, and contribute what one thing, and be as specific as possible here. When you post in the box, you can then click on to view the messages to see what other people have posted. If it doesn't work for you, you can't do it on my shared screen, so I'll put the link direct to that page in the text chat. You can just put the response in the text chat and we'll try and transfer it. But the advantage of doing it in the resource itself is that it will appear there for you to review afterwards as well. There's a page about Xerte. You've heard us talk about Xerte and the native accessibility and so on, and links there where you might want to follow that up. And in terms of being savvy, if you view this resource and you want to check what things you viewed and what things you didn't, we added a results page, and you can download the PDF file there just to keep a record of what you covered when you access the resource in your own time. So I'll go just back to the open mic discussion topic. There's a reminder there of the sessions that are coming up. And I think miraculously we're on time again, guys. You're laughing, but you're muted, Lillian, I think.
So thank you very much, Ron. And it'll be lovely to feature the What One Thing page again and encourage people to add to that. And then while people are adding their one thing that they'll take away, if anyone would like to take the mic, please do feel free.
I'll remember to check that my slides are showing.
It doesn't matter how many years you've been presenting, without fail, we all we all have that possible issue.
Sorry, I was late. Did the Appraise, I'm just interested what people thought of the Appraise tool.
Yeah, people really liked it. And we felt that we had to add one more question to the accessibility section, which I've now added, by the way.
Brilliant.
Which was, does the tool have an accessibility statement? I thought it was quite relevant to add that in. So I've added it to the copy of the form. So if you make a copy, I think it should appear. If it doesn't, you can always add it in. That's the beauty of the copy of the form.
Yeah.
And locally, if you have other triggers, you might want to add those. But with these forms, you have to be careful to not bloat it too much, right? It's better to have a level 1 review, and then that gets them started. And then you can ask them to think about other things further on from there.
Yeah.
There's your feedback, Alistair. Appraise to appraise to appraise.
There we go. Good.
Oh, it
good.
could just be someone clicked many times.
That's just me putting it in for my ego.
While I've still got the tab open, if anyone does want to go down from the first session, there's all these tools that people said they used to use that have long since disappeared. If you've got more recent ones, then you can navigate to that page and add them in as well.
Adil's asking for the PowerPoint of the session, so I just the whole resource is not a PowerPoint per se. It's the resource that Ron put the link in, where Ron put the link to the What One Thing. That just takes you to one of the end pages of the resource from where you can navigate right back to the beginning or use the table of contents. I'll find that link again. In fact, what I'll do, I'll give you the link of the very beginning and that should. Let me just check that I've got the right one for you. And if you have your own Xerte installation, you can, this is all Creative Commons content, so you can adapt it, link it to your own teaching and learning resources as well. Sorry, I'm not.
So on that note, I'm going to stop the recording.
Thank you very much, Alastair. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.